The musket ball that would shatter American dreams whistled through the pre-dawn darkness of December 31st, 1775, finding its mark in the shoulder of General Richard Montgomery as he stumbled backward in the narrow streets of Quebec City, blood staining the fresh snow beneath his feet. The ambitious colonial assault on British North America's most formidable fortress began its catastrophic unraveling. The audacious plan had been conceived in the fevered imagination of Benedict Arnold, the same man who would later become synonymous with betrayal. But in the autumn of 1775, Arnold was still a patriot hero, his reputation burnished by his daring capture of Fort Ticonderoga earlier that year. Where the Continental Congress authorized the invasion of Canada, Arnold saw an opportunity to strike a blow that would bring the northern provinces into the American Rebellion and deny Britain a crucial staging ground for future operations. Two columns would converge on Quebec City like the jaws of a trap. Montgomery, a former British officer who had fought alongside Wolfe on these very plains of Abraham 16 years earlier, would lead one force up the traditional route along Lake Champlain and the Richelieu River. Arnold, meanwhile, would attempt something far more daring, a march through the Maine wilderness that would bring his men to the walls of Quebec. From an unexpected direction, Arnold's route through the Quebec River Valley had seemed feasible on paper, but the reality proved nearly catastrophic. His force of 1,050 men, including companies of Pennsylvania riflemen and New England militia, began their journey in September with high hopes and inadequate maps. The rivers ran backwards from what their guides had promised, forcing exhausting portages through trackless wilderness. Early winter storms turned streams into torrents and trails into quagmires. By the time Arnold's ragged survivors reached the St. Lawrence River in November, nearly half his men had turned back, deserted, or died from exposure and disease. Those who remained were walking skeletons, their uniforms in tatters, their muskets rusted from constant exposure to moisture. They had eaten their leather cartridge boxes, boiled their moccasins for soup, and survived on a diet of roots and the occasional fish caught in icy streams. According to historical records maintained by the Quebec Historical Society, Arnold's force had covered over 350 miles through some of North America's most unforgiving terrain, a feat that would have impressed even seasoned frontiersmen. Under better circumstances, Montgomery's approach had been more conventional but equally challenging. After capturing Montreal in November, he had moved down the St. Lawrence with about 300 men, gathering Canadian volunteers along the way who promised more than they delivered. The British garrison at Quebec, under the command of Lieutenant Governor Guy Carleton, had withdrawn behind the city's massive stone walls, leaving Montgomery to contemplate the most daunting siege of the war. When the two American forces finally united outside Quebec in early December, they numbered fewer than 1,000 effective soldiers. Many lacked proper winter clothing, ammunition was running short, and smallpox was beginning its deadly work among the ranks. The enlistments of many New England troops would expire on December 31st, creating a ticking clock that would drive the Americans toward a desperate gamble. Rather than a patient siege, Lieutenant Governor Guy Carleton stood atop the citadel's ramparts, his breath forming clouds in the bitter December air as he surveyed the American positions scattered across the plains of Abraham. Below him, Quebec City sprawled like a medieval fortress transplanted to the New World, its massive stone walls rising directly from the St. Lawrence River's icy banks. No European city in North America was better positioned to withstand a siege, and Carleton knew it. The man defending Quebec was no ordinary colonial administrator. Carleton had served with distinction under General Wolfe during the famous battle that had won Canada for Britain in 1759. He understood both the strategic importance of Quebec and the tactical advantages his position provided. The city sat on a promontory 150 feet above the St. Lawrence, accessible by land only through a narrow corridor that his artillery could easily command. Inside the walls, Carleton commanded a mixed force of about 1,800 men. The corps consisted of British regulars from the 7th Regiment of Foot, seasoned professionals who had volunteered to extend their service rather than return to England. Alongside them stood French-Canadian militia, many of whom had little love for the British, but even less desire to see their province overrun by American rebels. Royal Navy sailors from ships frozen in the harbor provided additional manpower and expert gunnery skills. The American camp outside the walls presented a stark contrast to British professionalism. Arnold's men huddled in makeshift shelters cobbled together from whatever materials they could scavenge. Many lacked proper winter uniforms, wrapping themselves in blankets or captured British greatcoats. Their weapons were a mixture of hunting rifles, old muskets, and improvised pikes. Discipline, never strong among colonial militia, was breaking down as men deserted nightly, slipping away into the Canadian wilderness. Montgomery faced an impossible situation. His artillery consisted of a few light cannons that could barely scratch Quebec's massive walls. A traditional siege would require months, but he lacked the supplies, manpower, and time for such an undertaking. The enlistments of most of his New England troops would expire with the old year, potentially reducing his force by half overnight. Smallpox was spreading through the ranks, and Canadian civilians, initially curious about the American cause, were increasingly hostile as the occupation dragged on. The weather itself seemed allied with the British. December 1775 brought some of the worst winter conditions in memory. Temperatures plunged well below zero, and howling winds off the St. Lawrence cut through even the heaviest clothing. American sentries were found frozen at their posts, their muskets seized, solid with ice. Supply lines back to the American colonies were virtually non-existent, leaving Montgomery's men dependent on what they could forage or purchase from increasingly reluctant Canadian farmers. Inside Quebec, conditions were hardly luxurious, but they were manageable. Carleton had spent the autumn gathering supplies and could feed his garrison through the winter. The city's stone buildings provided adequate shelter, and British discipline kept morale reasonably high. More importantly, Carleton knew that spring would bring reinforcements from Britain, while American strength would only continue to deteriorate as December drew to a close. Both commanders understood that the siege could not continue indefinitely. Montgomery faced the prospect of watching his army melt away through desertion and disease, while Carleton had to worry about the psychological effects of remaining passive behind his walls. The stage was set for a dramatic confrontation that would determine not just the fate of Quebec, but potentially the entire Canadian campaign. The decision, when it came, would be driven by desperation rather than strategy, by calendar dates rather than military logic. Neither commander could have predicted how completely the coming battle would reshape American assumptions about their northern neighbors and their own revolutionary cause. The Council of War convened in Montgomery's headquarters on December 27, 1775, bore little resemblance to the confident planning sessions that had launched the Canadian campaign months earlier. Around a rough wooden table in a commandeered farmhouse outside Quebec's walls, the American commanders faced a crisis that threatened to destroy their army. Without a single major battle, Montgomery spread his crude maps across the table's scarred surface, his fingers tracing the stone walls that had defied every conventional assault option. Artillery bombardment had proven useless against fortifications designed to withstand European siege warfare. The few cannons at his disposal had barely chipped the massive ramparts, while British counter-battery fire had destroyed several American gun positions and killed experienced artillerymen who could not be replaced. Colonel Benedict Arnold, still recovering from a leg wound suffered during the march through Maine, argued passionately for immediate action. His men, he reported, were deserting at an alarming rate as news of the hardships reached families back home. More critically, smallpox had appeared in several companies, threatening to accomplish what British muskets had not. Arnold's solution was characteristically bold, a coordinated night assault on multiple points, designed to overwhelm the defenders through surprise and audacity. The plan that emerged from that desperate conference would become a textbook example of how military necessity can override tactical wisdom. Montgomery would lead the main assault against the lower town, advancing along the narrow path between the cliff and the river, where Quebec's defenses were theoretically weakest. Arnold would simultaneously attack from the opposite direction, his force moving through the northern suburbs to strike at the same objective from another angle. If both columns could penetrate the lower town and unite, they might fight their way up the steep streets to the upper town. At force Carleton's surrender, supporting attacks would pin down British reserves and prevent reinforcement of the main defensive positions. Captain John Lamb would lead a feint against the St. John Gate, while Major John Brown would create a diversion near Cape Diamond. The complexity of the plan reflected both American desperation and dangerous overconfidence in their ability to coordinate multiple night operations. In unfamiliar terrain during a Canadian winter, Montgomery's correspondence to his wife, later published in the American Historical Review, reveals his private doubts about the enterprise. the approaching end of the campaign, and the departure of the troops put us under the absolute necessity of trying something decisive. He understood that failure would likely end American hopes of bringing Canada into the rebellion, while success seemed to offer the only alternative to watching his army disintegrate through inaction. The weather on December 29th and 30th seemed designed to test American resolve. A howling blizzard dumped fresh snow across the battlefield while temperatures plunged to levels that froze sentries' breath into icicles on their scarves. Many of Montgomery's officers privately questioned whether men could fight effectively in such conditions, but the calendar provided no alternative. New Year's Eve would mark the end of enlistments for most New England troops, and Montgomery could not afford to lose nearly half his force while still maintaining the siege. Inside Quebec's walls, British preparations proceeded with methodical efficiency. Carleton had correctly anticipated that the Americans would eventually attempt an assault, and his intelligence network among French-Canadian civilians had provided detailed information about rebel plans and strength. The lieutenant governor positioned his regulars at key defensive points, while assigning militia companies to secondary positions, where their local knowledge would prove most valuable. The stage was set for a battle that would test not just military skill, but human endurance against one of nature's harshest seasons. Both sides understood that the coming fight would likely determine the fate of British North America, but neither could have predicted how completely the battle would reshape the strategic balance of the Revolutionary War. December 31st, 1775, dawned with the kind of bitter clarity that makes every breath a visible reminder of winter's grip. On the St. Lawrence Valley, inside Quebec's walls, Lieutenant Governor Carleton completed his final preparations for what intelligence reports suggested would be the Americans' desperate gamble outside those same walls. Montgomery's officers distributed ammunition that had been hoarded for weeks. Knowing that resupply would be impossible once the battle began, the American plan required precise timing that would have challenged experienced European armies operating in ideal conditions. Instead, Montgomery was asking colonial militia and frontiersmen to execute complex maneuvers in sub-zero temperatures through streets they had never seen, against defenders who knew every stone and alleyway of their fortress city. The margin for error was non-existent, but the alternative to action was watching his army dissolve through desertion and disease. Arnold's column formed up in the pre-dawn darkness north of the city, their breath creating a fog that obscured vision beyond a few yards. These men had already endured hardships that would have broken regular European troops. The survivors of the main wilderness march had developed a fierce esprit de corps. Forged by shared suffering, they trusted Arnold's leadership with the absolute faith that comes from having followed a commander through seemingly impossible circumstances and emerged alive. Montgomery's force assembled along the river path that would take them beneath Quebec's towering cliffs toward the lower town. Many of these men were New York and Pennsylvania volunteers who had joined the expedition expecting a quick campaign and easy victory. Instead, they found themselves preparing for what everyone understood might be a suicide mission. Their general would lead from the front as tradition demanded, but everyone knew that Montgomery's death would likely mean the collapse of organized resistance. The diversionary attacks began precisely at 4 o'clock in the morning, with Captain Lamb's artillery opening fire on the St. John Gate while Major Brown's men created commotion near Cape Diamond. Inside the city, British alarm bells began tolling as Carleton's carefully positioned defenders moved to their assigned positions. The lieutenant governor had anticipated this moment for weeks, and his preparation showed the thoroughness of a professional soldier who understood that Quebec's fall might mean the loss of all British North America. According to archival records held by the National Archives of Canada, Carleton had positioned his strongest units at precisely the points where American intelligence suggested the main attacks would develop. Captain Laws commanded the barrier defending the approach Montgomery would take, while Captain McDougall's company held the position that would face Arnold's assault. Both positions had been reinforced with additional artillery and supplied with heated shot that would prove devastatingly effective in the narrow confines of the lower town streets. The storm that had been threatening all morning finally broke as the American columns moved toward their objectives. Wind-driven snow reduced visibility to mere yards while temperatures plunged toward levels that would freeze exposed flesh within minutes. Men stumbled over obstacles invisible in the swirling white darkness, while officers shouted orders that were lost in the howling wind. What had been planned as a coordinated assault was rapidly degenerating into separate unconnected attacks by forces that could not communicate with each other or their commanders. Montgomery's advance along the river path became a nightmare of slipping, stumbling men trying to maintain formation on ice-slick rocks while carrying weapons that were becoming increasingly difficult to handle with numbed fingers. The narrow passage that had seemed like a tactical advantage in planning now appeared as a potential death trap where retreat would be as dangerous as advance. Behind them, the St. Lawrence River offered only freezing death, while ahead lay British positions that every intelligence report described as heavily fortified and well defended. The first shots of the battle would ring out within the hour, but already the weather and terrain were accomplishing what British strategy had failed to achieve. The American force was being separated into isolated fragments that would have to fight their battles alone, without coordination or mutual support. The musket blast that killed General Montgomery erupted from the darkness at precisely 20 minutes past 4 on the morning of December 31st, 1775. The British defenders at Prestonville Barrier had waited in perfect silence as the American column stumbled through the storm toward their carefully prepared position. When Montgomery himself appeared in the lead, sword drawn and shouting encouragement to his men, Captain Chaben's company unleashed a devastating volley at point-blank range. Montgomery fell instantly, his body crashing into the snow-covered rocks beside the St. Lawrence. Behind him, his aide-de-camp Captain John McPherson and several other officers dropped in the same volley. The psychological impact on the American column was immediate and catastrophic. These men had followed Montgomery through months of hardship, trusting his leadership and experience to see them through whatever dangers lay ahead. With their general dead and most of their officers casualties, the assault dissolved into chaos. Colonel Donald Campbell, next in command, attempted to rally the survivors and continue the attack, but the narrow path that had funneled them toward the barrier now trapped them under continuous British fire. Men pressed against the cliff face seeking shelter that did not exist, while others tried to retreat over ground made treacherous by ice and bodies. Within minutes, what had been an organized military advance became a rout as surviving Americans fled back along the river path, abandoning their dead and wounded to the storm and British bayonets. Meanwhile, Arnold's column was fighting for its life in the narrow streets of the lower town's northern approach. Unlike Montgomery's force, Arnold's men had actually penetrated the outer defenses, overwhelming the first British barrier through sheer determination and superior numbers. But their success proved temporary as they advanced deeper into a maze of stone buildings and narrow alleys where every doorway and window might conceal enemy muskets. Arnold himself fell early in the fighting, a musket ball shattering his left leg and leaving him helpless in the snow. Command devolved to Captain Daniel Morgan, the Virginia frontiersman whose riflemen had earned fame during the siege of Boston. Morgan possessed the tactical skill and personal courage to continue the assault, but he faced an impossible situation. His men were scattered through unfamiliar streets, communications were non-existent in the storm, and British reinforcements were converging on his position from multiple directions. The brutal reality of urban warfare in winter conditions soon became apparent. Muskets misfired in the cold and wet, while men's fingers became too numb to reload effectively. The storm that had been intended to conceal American movements now worked against them. As they stumbled through streets that British defenders knew intimately, every intersection became a potential ambush site, while the stone buildings that lined the narrow ways provided perfect cover for defenders, while offering none for attacking forces. Research conducted by the Canadian War Museum indicates that the fighting in the lower town continued for nearly 3 hours, with American forces actually controlling several key positions before British counterattacks drove them back. Morgan's riflemen, accustomed to wilderness warfare, adapted quickly to urban combat and inflicted heavy casualties on British regulars, who underestimated colonial fighting ability. But adaptation could not overcome fundamental strategic disadvantage. The diversionary attacks had failed to draw off significant British strength, leaving Carleton free to concentrate his forces against the two main American columns. Worse, the failure to coordinate timing meant that Montgomery's and Arnold's forces never united as planned, allowing British defenders to defeat them separately rather than facing a combined assault. They might not have been able to stop by dawn. American hopes for a quick victory had died in the snow-filled streets of Quebec's lower town. Morgan, surrounded and facing overwhelming odds, was forced to surrender with the remnants of Arnold's column. The bodies of Montgomery and his officers lay frozen beside the St. Lawrence, while surviving Americans either fled into the Canadian wilderness or huddled in whatever shelter they could find, wondering whether their cause could survive such a devastating defeat. Dawn on January 1st, 1776, revealed the full extent of American catastrophe in the narrow streets. Below Quebec's towering walls, Lieutenant Governor Carleton, surveying the battlefield from the city's ramparts, could scarcely believe the completeness of his victory. In less than 4 hours of fighting, the rebel army that had threatened British control of Canada had been shattered beyond immediate repair. The casualty figures told a stark story of military miscalculation and winter warfare's brutal realities. Montgomery's death had demoralized his entire column, but the human cost extended far beyond a single general's fate. Captain John McPherson, the young aide-de-camp, who had served as Montgomery's surrogate son, lay frozen beside his commander. Captain Jacob Cheeseman of the New York Artillery had fallen in the same volley, along with a sergeant and several privates whose names would be recorded in pension records. But forgotten by history, Arnold's column had suffered even more severely. In absolute numbers, though their sacrifice had at least achieved temporary tactical success before ultimate failure. Captain Daniel Morgan's surrender included over 400 men, representing nearly half of the effective American force that had begun the assault. Among the prisoners were some of the finest soldiers in American service, Pennsylvania riflemen, whose accuracy had terrorized British forces around Boston, New England militia companies with combat experience dating back to Lexington and Concord, and Virginia frontiersmen, whose wilderness skills had enabled Arnold's epic march through Maine. British losses, by contrast, were almost negligible. Carleton's careful defensive preparations and intimate knowledge of Quebec's terrain had allowed his forces to inflict maximum damage while suffering minimal casualties themselves. Captain Chabot's company, which had delivered the devastating volley that killed Montgomery, reported only 2 men wounded in the entire engagement. The defenders at other positions had similar results, testament to the advantages of fighting from prepared positions with clear fields of fire. The psychological impact of defeat extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. American confidence in their cause had been built on a series of early successes: the siege of Boston, the capture of Fort Ticonderoga, and Montgomery's easy conquest of Montreal. Quebec was supposed to be the capstone achievement that would bring Canada into the rebellion and deny Britain a crucial base for future operations. Instead, the defeat demonstrated that American forces could be decisively beaten when they faced professional opposition in circumstances that favored the defense. Benedict Arnold, evacuated from the battlefield with his shattered leg, assumed command of American survivors and attempted to maintain some semblance of a siege. But everyone understood that the strategic initiative had shifted permanently to the British. Inside Quebec, Carleton could afford to wait for spring reinforcements while American strength continued to erode through desertion, disease, and the simple impossibility of maintaining military operations in a Canadian winter without adequate supplies or local support. According to contemporary accounts preserved in the Massachusetts Historical Society, news of Quebec's failure reached the Continental Congress like a thunderbolt. The Northern strategy that had seemed so promising in the autumn of 1775 was revealed as a dangerous overextension of American capabilities. Resources committed to the Canadian campaign could not be used elsewhere, while the defeat provided British commanders with their first clear evidence that colonial forces could be overwhelmed through conventional military tactics properly applied. The battle's aftermath also revealed the complex loyalties that characterized British North America's civilian population. French Canadians, initially uncertain about both British rule and American liberation, had observed the siege with careful neutrality. Quebec's successful defense demonstrated that British power remained formidable, encouraging fence-sitters to declare their loyalty to the Crown, while discouraging potential American sympathizers from revealing themselves. For individual American families, Quebec represented personal tragedies that would echo through generations. Montgomery's widow would spend decades seeking compensation for her husband's sacrifice, while Arnold's vow would plague him for the remainder of his life and contribute to the bitterness that eventually led to his treason. The final American withdrawal from Quebec occurred not with dramatic military action, but through the gradual dissolution that characterizes failed campaigns. Throughout the winter and spring of 1776, Benedict Arnold's makeshift siege lines slowly emptied as men deserted, died from disease, or simply walked away when their enlistments expired. By May, when British reinforcements arrived from Halifax, fewer than 300 effective American soldiers remained to contest control of the St. Lawrence Valley. The strategic consequences of Quebec's failure rippled across the entire Revolutionary War. Britain retained its crucial northern stronghold, providing a secure base for future operations against American territory. The St. Lawrence River remained a British highway, allowing supplies and reinforcements to flow freely between the Atlantic and the Great Lakes. Most importantly, the defeat ensured that Canada would remain British territory, fundamentally altering the geopolitical balance of North America for centuries to come. Individual careers and reputation suffered lasting damage from the Quebec disaster. Benedict Arnold's physical wounds healed slowly, but his ego never recovered from what he perceived as inadequate recognition for his sacrifices. The bitterness that would eventually drive him to treason can be traced directly to his experiences during the Canadian campaign, where enormous personal hardships had yielded only defeat and criticism. Arnold's transformation from patriot hero to American villain began in the snow-covered streets of Quebec's lower town. The death of Richard Montgomery deprived America of one of its most experienced military commanders. At a crucial moment in the war's development, Montgomery's background as a former British officer had provided credibility to American claims of military competence. His death demonstrated that colonial forces could not simply rely on courage and determination to overcome professional opposition. Armed with superior weapons and operating from strong defensive positions for the British Empire, Quebec's successful defense provided evidence that American rebellion could be contained and ultimately defeated through conventional military strategy. Lieutenant Governor Carleton's victory encouraged British planners to believe that decisive action could end the colonial uprising before it spread beyond control. This overconfidence would contribute to strategic mistakes elsewhere, but in the immediate aftermath of Quebec, British morale received a crucial boost that sustained imperial resolve. Through the war's darker moments, the battle also established patterns of Canadian identity that would persist long after American independence became reality. French-Canadian participation in Quebec's defense, however limited, demonstrated that British North America's diverse population could unite against external threats. The successful resistance to American invasion became a founding myth of Canadian nationalism, contributing to a distinct North American identity that remained loyal to the British Crown while developing its own cultural characteristics. Modern historians, analyzing the battle through documents preserved in the National Archives of both Canada and the United States, have reached consensus that Quebec represented a crucial turning point in the Revolutionary War's Northern Theater. The defeat ended American hopes of creating a 14th colony and forced the Continental Congress to abandon offensive operations in favor of defensive strategies that would characterize the remainder of the conflict. The frozen bodies of Montgomery and his officers, recovered after the battle and buried with military honors, became symbols of American sacrifice in an unsuccessful cause. Their graves in Quebec City remain pilgrimage sites for 19th-century American tourists seeking to understand their nation's revolutionary origins. The battle itself entered American folklore as an example of courageous failure, demonstrating that the Revolution's ultimate success required learning from early defeats as much as celebrating victories. Today, the Battle of Quebec stands as a reminder that military history often turns on moments when weather, terrain, and timing combine to defeat even the most carefully laid plans. Montgomery's assault failed not because of cowardice or incompetence, but because winter warfare in 18th century conditions created challenges that no amount of courage could overcome. The Patriots' first major defeat became a hard-earned lesson in the limits of revolutionary enthusiasm when confronted by professional military opposition. Operating from positions of strength,